there, and welcome to our show, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. I'm Bianca Murray, and I'm joined by Carly Waters and Cece Lira from PS Literary Agency. Today's guest is the author of 9 works of fiction, including 2 short story collections and a novel for young readers. Her most recent novel, Sam, was a Read with Jenna selection and a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and was named a Best Book of the Year by Vogue and Real Simple. Her fiction has appeared in The New Yorker and elsewhere and has been anthologized in the O. Henry Awards and Best American Short Stories. Her essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the American Scholar. She is the recipient of a Whiting Award and a fellowship from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. It's my pleasure to welcome Allegra Goodman. Allegra, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It is such an honor to chat to you today. So for our listeners, I'm just explaining that the book that we are discussing today is Isola. Is that how you pronounce it, Allegra?
I was corrected myself yesterday by a friend who knows Italian. She goes, Isola.
Isola. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Those of you watching the YouTube channel will see the cover of the book. Beautiful cover. I'm going to read you the flap copy and then we're going to dive in because there's so much I need to speak to Allegra about. So here we go. Heir to a chateau with its own village and lands, Marguerite is destined for a life of prosperity and gentility. Then she is orphaned, and Jean-Francois de la Roque de Roberval, an enigmatic and volatile man Marguerite has never met, becomes her guardian, controlling her future. He sells her property to pay his debts, leaving her destitute, and insists she accompany him on an expedition to New France. Isolated and afraid, Marguerite befriends Roberval's servant, and the two develop an intense attraction. But when Roberval discovers Marguerite's deception, his rage is all-consuming. As punishment, he maroons her and her lover on a small island. Once a child of privilege, who dressed in gowns and laced pearls in her hair, Marguerite finds herself at the mercy of nature. As the weather turns, blanketing the island in ice, survival becomes nearly impossible. She despairs. Has everyone and everything she once held dear abandoned her? A riveting portrait inspired by the real life of a 16th century heroine and a gorgeous celebration of the power of the natural world. I'm going to say it wrong again. Isola is the timeless story of a woman realizing her true strength. So just wow. So first question for you, Allegra, is in an industry that tries really hard to pigeonhole writers as either one thing or another, because let's be honest, it makes it so much easier to market them, right? You've shown incredible range throughout a 35-year career with narratives about rock climbing loners, virtual reality gamers, Orthodox Jewish families in the Catskills. So can you speak a bit about this and the importance about writing about topics that interest and transport you regardless of their so-called genre or whether they're contemporary or historical?
Yeah, I think that is a really important point that in terms of the industry and marketing of a book, people love consistency, right? But if you're an artist, you love to work on what interests you and what you're passionate about. So I've always been sort of more on the side of writing what I'm interested in or, writing what draws me imaginatively. And early on, especially when I was very young and just starting out as a writer, I did feel some pressure because people were sort of like, especially if you have something that succeeds, they want the last book that you did. So my very first book was a book of, very satirical, lighthearted stories, very funny. And then I wrote a novel which was sort of very different in tone, sort of elegiac and a completely different mood. Like you wouldn't have guessed it was the same, it was me. And my editor at the time, now passed away, actually said to me, "Here's the sparkling Allegra Goodman that I loved so much from your last book. What is this?" And it was very discouraging when I was young to hear that because I thought idealistically, a writer should grow, a writer should go to new places. And I thought it was progress to do something different, not disappointing. But eventually, as I persisted and kept working on different subjects, I found that editors started to follow where I was going a little more. And I'm not a genre writer in terms of writing in one genre, you know. I would also say that over time, I have certain themes that I come back to, certain ideas that I'm interested in, even though the setting of my book might be different, or the tone or the voice of the book might be different. I am interested in families. I'm interested in intergenerational conflict. I'm very interested in religion and what people believe and what they doubt, what they don't believe. I'm interested in self deception and the illusions that people carry with them. And all of those sort of thread through my work. I'm also very interested in women and their role in the world, and young women and how they deal with the challenges that custom and culture impose on them. And I would say, especially in my recent work with my last novel, Sam, which was about a young girl in the 21st century, and this novel is Isola, about a young woman growing up in the 16th century, very far apart in time period and very different in setting and in the tone of the book, but they're both about women sort of coming into their own, coming into their power. And so there is continuity there as well. So one way to talk about your question is that a writer can say, there's a through line in my work, there is consistency in my work. And maybe let's not think so literally about writing the same kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And that's something we say on the podcast all the time is don't try and chase trends. Don't go, what is publishing? So I'm going to try and write that. Always write what you are passionate about. I talk about it in terms of the waving a turkey leg at family Thanksgiving, the thing that gets you really riled up and the things that will keep bringing you back to the chair because that's what you have to say about the world. And that is regardless of genre or contemporary or historical. So I absolutely love what you're saying there. There is an author note that you wrote, Allegra, that I would like us to discuss because there was just after finishing the book and I read the author's note and it just blew my mind and there's so much to unpack there. So could you just tell us a bit about what's in the author's note?
So at the end of the book, in my author's note, I talk about how I came upon this true story of a young woman in the 16th century who traveled to the New World, or New France, as they called it. She was coming from France. So this was 22 years ago. I was traveling with my family to Canada. We live in Massachusetts, and we took a road trip up to Montreal. And we had four children, our four children with us, who were at the time 10 years old, 7, 3, and a newborn. I don't know why we were traveling when I just had this baby. I think she was about 6 weeks old. So I think I was in sort of postpartum euphoria or something like that. But we're driving up to Canada, and I had taken with me a whole stack of books that I checked out from the public library about Canadian history, which I thought I would share with the boys. So on this trip, the boys had no interest in any of these books and, of course, didn't read any of them. And I read all of them because I was up all night nursing the baby. And I just remember sitting up in bed with the baby in my arms, one after another, looking at these books. They were all children's books or young adult books about Canadian history. And I was reading a book about the explorations of Jacques Cartier to Canada. And he did three expeditions, three times he sailed to the New World. And on the third expedition, and this I would add is 75 years at least before the Pilgrims, made their progress to Massachusetts. He, on the third expedition, there was a ship which went out with a captain named Roberval, which was full of colonists, which were supposed to settle in the new world, in this new land, and according to the king, spread Catholicism, throughout the land. And in parentheses, in this discussion of this ship of colonists, it said, on the ship, there was a kinsman of the commander who was a young woman named Marguerite de Roberval. She annoyed the commander and he set her down and marooned her on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I just sort of sat up in bed and I was like, what? Wait, what? Close parentheses, then back to Roberval and Cartier. It was so emblematic, the women's history in the, cloistered in the parentheses. And we go back to the male explorers. And I was like, wait, what happened to her? What does she do on this island? Isn't it subarctic there? What in the world? And at the time, I thought, oh, this would be such an interesting story to explore and maybe to write a novel about. I need to look into this. But I didn't end up doing it right away. I wrote a lot of other books. I was raising these children. And also, I thought, and this goes back to your first point, I was like, wait, I don't write historical fiction. So even I, who pretend that I don't like to be pigeonholed, I was sort of like, that stresses me out. I can't imagine doing the research. What do they wear? What do they eat? What was the ship like? Too much. So I kept putting the idea aside and working on other projects. And my kids got older, and I ended up having more time, and I started doing a lot of reading. I was still kind of intimidated by the idea of starting this novel. But in the end, while I was writing Sam, which was the novel about the contemporary, the 21st century young girl who was a boulderer, climbing rocks all the time, I really felt compelled by this idea. And this maybe is another thing that writers and some of the listeners may feel, that sometimes an idea chooses you. And, I could not write them at that point. I've done a lot of reading, and I didn't call it a novel. I called it Project M, after Marguerite, which, project, not a book. And I didn't do it on my computer. I was writing Sam on my computer officially. And then I was sort of cheating on Sam by, I had a notebook and a pen, and I was sort of working by hand, trying out openings for this new novel, which would have been a historical novel. And I took this notebook and I just wrote the first sentence. I just thought, let's just see if I can just write one sentence, because I really was intimidated. And over again, I wrote the first sentence of this book by hand. And until I got to the point where I wrote this line, and it said, I never knew my mother. She died the night that I was born, and so we passed each other in the dark. And then I thought, oh, there she is. She's speaking to me. And not to make light of all the work that I did after that, but once I had that sentence, I had the voice of the book, or the voice of the woman, in my head. And it was a little bit like she was telling me the story.
I love all of that. There is an alchemy to writing, and it is our own brains, but sometimes it does feel divine. It does feel like, we've been chosen to tell the story, and we kind of are just, channeling this person. And when that happens, it's just so incredibly magical. But okay, so sometimes I wonder as well, when a story idea comes to us, sometimes we are not the writer we need to be in terms of skill, in terms of life experience to tell that story. And sometimes I feel like we rush to tell a story, but some stories need that time. They need us to become the storyteller that story needs us to be in order to tell it. So I love that this story took you 22 years and it took another character sort of speaking to you. I just want to read your exact wording in the author's note for our listeners, because I especially love the wording of here. It goes, so I began to dream of writing this story, but I didn't do it. I wrote several other books, including Sam, a contemporary novel about a girl growing up bouldering in Massachusetts. However, all those years, even while writing Sam, I kept thinking about Marguerite. In fact, it was Sam herself who inspired me to write about Marguerite. I tucked away my interest in the French noblewoman, but as I wrote about Sam's coming of age, I began to think about Marguerite's journey of self-discovery. While writing Sam, I began to research Marguerite's voyage, and it carries on, and then it goes, but in the end, it was Sam who opened up this material for me. Sam, the climber and the striver, Sam, the survivor. Marguerite is a survivor too. And then it goes, in the mornings, I worked on Sam, writing and rewriting chapters on my computer. In the afternoons, I wrote by hand in a notebook, experimenting with different openings, as you said. But just that one character, writing one character can be the bridge to get you to another character, to me is just so incredibly fascinating. And so many writers would have parked it and gone, okay, I'll come back to that later. But you wrote the two at the same time, Allegra. Like, how?
Well, I should say, when I was younger, and this speaks to sometimes the time has to be right. I had more time because it was, so the baby, the newborn, was now 22 years old. She was graduating from, or actually, she's now 22. When I wrote the book, she was in college. She had started college. So I had no children at home, and I had more bandwidth to do both books. So that's just on the practical level. And I also had more maturity, but I discovered something about myself as a writer. And I wonder if some of your listeners might also find this interesting. I am not the kind of person who can just sort of hole up and like churn out a lot of material in one day. I'm a slow and steady writer. I write quite slowly. And I'm the kind of person that if I write one good page, I'm really happy with the day. And I have about 2 to 3 hours in me to work on a project. But what I discovered when I was writing Sam was that I, even though I only had that amount, that in me for Sam, I could work on a different project later in the day. So I couldn't write Sam all day and I couldn't write this one all day, but I did split the time. And it's the first time I've really sort of written two books at once in that way. I've always written short fiction at once and at the same time and done shorter pieces and that kind of thing, but not two novels at the same time. And I kind of love it.
I think the only other author that I've spoken to who does this is Lauren Groff, and I think she said that she would move desks. So she would write one book at one desk and then she would move desk completely, to write the other book if I'm not mistaken. And I'm actually going to reference her a little bit later with another question I have for you. But yeah, I just, when I write, I also have about 2 to 3 hours in me. I will sort of try and type faster to override my critical brain because I find if I write slower, I'm more pedantic and critical of each sentence. But we will talk about your writing on a sentence level because we can see you are pedantic about your writing on a sentence level because it does show, which is incredible. But yeah, to just hear of somebody working like this would just really blew my mind. And I love what you said about trying to find your way into the story because I find beginnings tremendously difficult because as you continue a story with each decision you make in terms of plot, in terms of character arc, in terms of this is the decision the characters made, you keep narrowing down your options, which makes it kind of easier. But the beginning is so wide open. You could begin anywhere. And I talk about it on the podcast as circling the building of your story to find the best way in. And sometimes it's the front door, sometimes it's the back door, sometimes it's a chimney or the fire escape. But it seems like for you, it was the same thing until you got to that sentence. How long, do you have any recollection of how long it took you to get to that opening?
I think it was several weeks, honestly, just for the opening. And I love your image of circling the building. That's a really great image. I've often described it, I do teach on occasion, and I've described it to students as sort of like when you start the puzzle, you have all the different pieces, but you don't have the picture on the box either because you have, you're messing the whole thing up as you go along. And it is true that as you progress in a novel, there are fewer choices because of the choices that you made before. So it's sort of like, but at the beginning, when you're starting the novel, it's sort of like, is this an edge piece or is this the center? Is this the background or is this the person? So yes, it can be overwhelming. The free.
It's almost like a white puzzle, never mind
Mm.
pictures on the puzzle without seeing it. It's just like you're putting together a whole puzzle that's all made up of white puzzle pieces at the beginning, and that's why it's so difficult. But when you get that opening, it is like this eureka moment because then you just feel it. So something else that I want to talk about is, so often with literary fiction, emerging writers especially think of literary fiction as jazz hands writing. It's like, look, Ma, I'm writing huge metaphors, purple prose. Yet the through line in all your work, besides all your themes, is also clear. There's this economy of language. Each sentence does what it's intended to do, no more. There are gut punch moments, but there's no grandstanding or jazz hands writing. So for our listeners, I'm just going to read you a page or two, a few paragraphs from the prologue. So, I still dream of birds. I watch them circle, dive into rough waters, and fly up to the sun. I call to them, but hear no answer. Alone, I stand on a stone island. I watch for ships and see three coming, tall ships, close enough to hail. I load my musket and shoot into the air. I see pennants close enough to touch as I run barefoot to the shore. Rocks cut my feet and I leave a trail of blood. Brambles tear my sleeves and score my arms as I shout, wait, stop, save me. And that's the beginning of the prologue. And then again, as you said, the opening sentence, I never knew my mother. She died the night I was born, and so we passed each other in the dark. She left me her name, Marguerite, and her ruby ring, but no memory of her. It's really like economy of language, but also really, really striking. Is this something that you just naturally had as a writer when you started writing all those years ago? Or is it something that's come with time? Have you had to be ruthless in terms of editing? Explain that process to us.
I do a lot of revision and I am ruthless. So I try to catch. places where I'm not clear or where I'm getting wordy. And I think over time, actually, and this is a great thing about writing, you get better as you get older. It's not like being an athlete where you're sort of done at 30. And I have learn to be clearer and to really, I want my words to do their work. I'm not interested in words for their own sake. And actually, even when I was very young, I decided I am not a poet. I am a storyteller. And, poets might be interested in the shape of the word on, or the way the word looks on the page. And I'm really interested in each of my words doing its job to tell the story. And I've often found actually that the best narrative effects often come when they're the most useful, you know. But when I started as a writer, I was mostly interested in voice and I was mostly interested in dialogue. That was sort of my strength. And in my early stories, they're almost like plays. I was never, as a writer or an early reader, that interested in description or all of those things. And that came later for me. And even now, when I do description, it's usually in character. It's often like a lot of times it's like through the perception of the hero or the heroine, and from what she sees, what she feels, what she hears. And again, that's where the words are doing their job. They're working to convey the story of this person.
And that brings me to another question in terms of voice, because I wanted to ask how you capture the voice. And especially when you're writing from the first person perspective of a woman living in like in 16th century France, right? I remember when I interviewed Lauren Groff about how she wrote dialogue for Matrix, which takes place in the 12th century. And when I was reading, I noticed that she had a hack in that she never used direct quotes for dialogue so that it didn't have to sound the way it sounded back then. She would use reported speech. And she said, yes, that was a hack to just get past all of that because it would have just been too difficult. So I imagine there was intentionality in your part in terms of saying, I am not going to try and sound like she would have sounded back then. I am going to, yes, there is formality in the language to indicate that it is historical fiction, but you use quoted dialogue. How did you approach that? Because I assume it was very intentional.
First of all, I found it liberating to think that these people would have all been speaking French to each other. So their idioms would have been in French. So we're reading it in English. So we already have that, that change. So I wasn't going to worry about like sounding Shakespearean or something like that, even though this is the time of Shakespeare. They weren't living in England and they weren't speaking Shakespearean English. They were speaking French. So, and then the other way that I worked on the voice was I actually read stuff that was written at that time and thought about it and found it idiomatic, and so I was interested in sort of keeping the imagery and the world that they spoke about correct. I really wanted to avoid it sounding like obviously like a 21st century person like Sam would talk, but just being clear and clean. And strangely, it was that part didn't bother me too much. I did use quotation marks. I like Lauren's idea with the dashes. And I do
Yeah.
remember that from the Matrix.
Yeah. It was an interesting hack, but you made it work so well here, even though you went a completely different route. And you mentioned in the author's note something about being an actor, and that is how I write. I kind of do a method acting form of writing. So whenever I interview authors, I say, do you see your characters acting out in front of you, almost as if you are a godlike being, or do you climb into the character and look out at their world from their eyes? And it's very clear to me that you climb into the character and look out from their eyes, because as you say, every description is through the lens of their experience, how they would see it, etc. Now, again, that's so interesting that you would write one character in the morning, another character in the afternoon. Did it help that one was first person and one was third person? And do you use that sort of actor method form of writing?
I do. You have it exactly right. I try to get inside the character and in a method sort of way, including like doing all this research, which might not appear in on the page, just the way an actor might ask a lot of questions about the character that don't appear in the script, but just to inform the performance. That's very much how I work. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that Sam is in the third person and this is in the first. She's in a very intimate third person and this is the first person. I guess in terms of if you want to carry the theater, image further, I was doing them in repertory.
Love it.
But I found it refreshing, strangely. And, again, it was sort of this, Sam was the book I knew I had to finish, that I had the contract for. This one, and here's another important point I didn't mention, but I didn't tell anyone that I was working on this secret project. That's why I called it Project M. I was sort of pretending it was like a secret, even for myself. And so I didn't tell my family, I didn't tell my husband, I didn't tell my agent I was working on this. And because I was a little nervous at the beginning, and also later, I enjoyed the secrecy and being able to protect it. So I worked on it for a year and a half before I had the first draft, before I confessed that I was working on it. But I wanted to get to the end. That was also unusual for me. But maybe that secrecy part also. I had a public project and a private project.
It is lovely sometimes to have that delicious secret because you feel so protective of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why writers feel superstitious about talking about something until they know it's a real thing, etc. Something I want to ask, because Sam could have been written in the first person. And like you say, it's an intimate, really close third person. And this is something that a lot of emerging writers struggle with. They think, oh, well, first person is just pronouns. It's just I and me, and third person is just she and her. But there's a lot of intentionality that has to come to choosing, which point of view you're using. And I'm starting a new project now, and I'm busy circling the building, and I keep going backwards and forwards between first person and third person close. So what was your mindset when it came to Sam, when you decided this is going to be third person, and what was the mindset here? Or do you find that it comes to you instinctively and you don't really have to give it too much thought?
With Sam, it sort of came instinctively in that, and there again, when I wrote the first line of that book, all of Sam is written in language that she would have understood at her age. So this book starts when she's 7 years old. And the first sentence of the book is, there's a girl and her name is Sam, which is almost the kind of book that she would be able to read at that age. And then as she gets older, the language of the book changes and gets more complex. And I was really interested in playing with that, telling her story almost in the style of the books that she would be able to read at those different ages. With this book, Isola, I was thinking a lot about sort of the great tradition of castaway novels. And, as you know, like when you're a writer, you do a lot of research in terms of the background of the character and all that, but you can also do research in terms of other people who've written in that genre. So I was thinking about Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels and Kidnapped and other books in which the person ends up on an island. And they were in the first person. And I thought of this book as a female Robinson Crusoe. And she's telling the story as what happened to her. And I was also really interested in the way that stories, survival stories, and especially women's stories, can be subverted and changed and stolen from them. And I played with that in this book as well. So, but here she is telling it as she saw it. And the reader is then invested and knows what she experienced, so that later on, we know the difference between what she says and what other people say.
Yeah, I'm interested in the person who wrote the children's book that you read, because by putting her in the parentheses, I'm wondering if it's a woman who wrote it who just wanted to put a stamp. Here's Marguerite. It's not part of the story, but I'm damn well putting it here, and I'm hoping someone will notice it. Or if it was a man who was like, "Oh, this is just an afterthought. It's interesting."
It
But
was a man.
yeah, yes. Okay, there we go. Damn it. Damn it. I was hoping for a woman who was like, I'm supposed to be writing a book about this person, but I'm just going to put this in here. Okay, last question that we have time for, because on the podcast, we review query letters and opening pages from emerging authors to help them polishing it up ahead of querying agents. And most times, 9 times out of 10, the prologue does not work. It's a band-aid tacked on to fix a first chapter that is just not working. Now, I know you started with chapter 1, so clearly you came back to the prologue. So again, when it comes to intentionality, why the prologue, and at what point did that come into the story?
Oh, such an interesting question, and I can see that you really think about these craft ideas. But I'll be very honest, I didn't have a prologue. I wrote the whole book. For me, that first page was the first page, and it was my editor who, late in this process, I think even when it was going into copy editing, suggested a prologue to me. And I will also be honest that I didn't love the idea of writing a prologue. I felt like it was done. I'm with you. I don't usually like prologues, but she wanted to give a sense of what was going to happen, because the book has a lead up. It's she wanted to give the reader that sense of the adventure to come and to tie it in later. And I started getting intrigued by her idea because Marguerite is now looking back and telling the story, which is another thing that happens with the first person. With the third person, you don't know what could happen to that character, right? Like with the first person, you know that she's like alive to tell the story, right?
Yeah.
Unless she's a ghost or something. So I experimented with different kinds of prologues, and my brilliant editor, Whitney Frick, was the one who really urged me to do it. And I tried different ideas and then came up with this idea of her still dreaming about the island. And Whitney said she liked that one, and we used it. And then I saw that how people responded to it, and I was thinking, oh, you're a good editor. You did the right thing. But it certainly wasn't there when I first submitted the book, or in not at all. It came much later.
But it was such a good choice because when you described the book now, you described it as like the female sort of castaway story. And had you begun just with chapter 1, we wouldn't have got that. So the prologue set the scene, gave us a flash forward to the future. So we knew it was a female sort of castaway story. So yeah, excellent addition down the line. And that's the thing. Your editor can suggest something, but you as the writer get to decide if you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. Because again, that prologue could have gone any which way and it went the way you decided it was going to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is why this is a good example of editor and writer working constructively together, and both knowing the book really well. Also, it helped that the book was done,
Yeah.
So then the prologue became part of the frame of the book rather than the band-aid, as or something, or the afterthought or something like that.
Yeah. Love it. Allegra, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful chatting with you. I'm going back now and I'm going to dive into your whole backlist. I love it when I discover a writer and I'm like, the backlist, I got to get to it. So for our listeners, we are linking to the book on our bookshop.org affiliate page. If you buy it there, you support an independent bookstore and you support the podcast at the same time. Please get the book, read it, especially if you're someone who's writing in literary fiction and, struggling with the language. This is just a masterclass in that. Thank you, Allegra.
Thank you so much for having me.
A reminder that this is an unscripted program and our conversations have been edited and condensed and is not a full picture of our feedback or conversation directly with each author. As always, refer back to our written notes for the fulsome picture. Carly Waters and Cece Lira are agents at PS Literary Agency, but their work on this podcast is not affiliated with the agency, and the views expressed by Carly and Cece on this podcast are solely that of them as podcast co-hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, policies, or position of PS Literary Agency. A reminder about all the ways that you can support us as a show: rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, tell your writing friends about us. We'd love to help as many writers as possible. And follow us on our Substack newsletter. Get our stacked newsletter on a weekly basis, bonus videos, articles, essays, advice, and more. You can find it at theshitaboutwriting.substack.com. That's theshitaboutwriting.substack.com.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you'll join us for next week's show. In the meantime, keep at it. Remember, it just takes one yes.